This video is brought to you by Brilliant. For the past few years, economists have been trying to persuade China to rebalance its economy away from investment towards consumption. While it looked like the CCP might have finally heeded their advice earlier this month, when they committed to a raft of stimulus measures, it's since become overwhelmingly apparent that Xi has no plans to rebalance anytime soon. However, relatively recent comments by Xi and other CCP officials suggest that Xi does have a plan to fix the economy, but it involves redirecting investment away from property towards science. So in this video, we're going to have a look at Xi's plan to science his way out of China's economic crisis, and why, while it might be sexier, tech investment can be just as unsustainable as property investment. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, as we've argued in previous videos, the root cause of China's economic crisis is plausibly the fact that consumption accounts for a disproportionately small share of its overall GDP. Essentially, GDP is often defined as the sum of four things: government spending, business investment, household consumption, and the difference between exports and imports. Household consumption makes up a disproportionately small fraction of Chinese GDP, something like 40%. In practice, this means that your average Chinese person doesn't really buy or consume that much stuff, and the Chinese economy is instead mostly driven by exports to foreigners. The basic reason for this is pretty simple. Through a variety of mechanisms, including an undervalued currency, China essentially underpays its workers, keeping them poor and keeping China's exports competitive. Conversely, investment makes up too large a share of China's GDP. This might sound a bit weird if you're from the West, because, well, basically every Western country is desperately in need of higher investment. But China has almost the opposite problem. The province of Guizhou illustrates this well. Guizhou is a picturesque mountainous province in the southwest of China. It's one of the poorest provinces in China, with a mostly agricultural economy and a GDP per capita of less than $7,000. But its GDP has been growing rapidly over the past few years. Most of this growth has been driven not by household consumption, but investment, especially in infrastructure. In the last 15 years or so, Guizhou's local government has built over 1,000 new bridges, including some of the highest in the world. The Duge Bridge, for example, cost over 1 trillion yuan and sits nearly 2,000 feet above the Beipan River. But most Guizhou residents are really quite poor, and it's not like they all own big cars that get stuck in traffic jams on one of the hundreds of bridges all already built. This means these new bridges haven't really increased productivity or tax revenues, which is why last year Guizhou's central government admitted that it had taken on too much debt to build all these bridges and needed help from the central government. Again, this is sort of the opposite problem that the West faces. If the UK built another bridge across the Thames in London, or even just fixed this one, it would probably be a productive investment. In other words, it would facilitate more economic activity to the point that it would eventually pay for itself. Anyway, this is why Western economists at the IMF and elsewhere have been counselling China to rebalance its economy away from investment towards consumption, presumably via some sort of stimulus to Chinese households and consumers. While the CCP have long resisted this advice, it looked for a moment like they might be performing a U-turn earlier this month, when the central government announced a raft of stimulus measures aimed at propping up the property sector and stock market. However, nothing more substantial has yet been announced, and it now looks like they were just stabilisation measures rather than the beginning of a wider U-turn. In other words, that Xi and the CCP have no plans to rebalance the economy away from investment towards consumption. So then, what actually is Xi's plan to save the Chinese economy? Well, according to recent public announcements by Xi and the other CCP elites in the Politburo, instead of rebalancing the economy from investment towards consumption, Xi wants to rebalance investment away from property and infrastructure towards technology and science. Now, many economists are understandably skeptical of this plan. From their perspective, it doesn't really matter where the investment goes. If there aren't economically active consumers to actually use the technology, it's still surplus investment. To give a concrete example, there's not much point in BYD developing amazing cutting-edge EVs if Chinese households can't afford them. Sure, they can instead export them to wealthier consumers abroad, but more and more countries are now becoming wary of their dependence on Chinese exports, and China's habit of exporting its so-called overcapacity abroad has become an increasingly contentious issue in global politics. More neoliberal-minded economists would also argue that it makes more sense to give Chinese households more money, and then investment can follow that new demand, rather than it being directed by the state. But Xi and the Politburo disagree on two fronts. First, they think that technological advances are the fundamental drivers of economic growth. In other words, economic growth is driven less by economics-y stuff like balancing the investment and consumption share of GDP, and more by technological advances like the invention of the steam engine. This might sound a bit, blunt, but there's a relatively widespread sense that we're not innovating as much as we used to, which Xi is apparently trying to remedy. Second, as well as an economic rationale, there's also a geopolitical rationale here, in that Xi and the CCP believe that staying at the technological front lines is key to China's geopolitical status. Xi made this argument most explicitly in a speech he gave to a whole load of Chinese scientists back in 2016, when he said that, quote, science and technology are the weapon of the country. So could this strategy actually work? Well, to protect China's geopolitical status, it needs to innovate at the same rate as the US in certain strategically important sectors like semiconductors, which seems doable. However, to restart the economy, China realistically needs to discover something akin to the steam engine, something that triggers a massive boom in productivity. Xi himself is explicit about this. Since 2013, he's been talking about, quote, a new round of scientific and technological revolution, which has recently become an increasingly common turn of phrase in Communist Party literature. Here, Xi seems to be referring to a popular framing amongst historians of science that divides the technological innovations of the last 3 centuries into 3 waves. The first begins in Great Britain during the mid-18th century with the invention of the steam engine. The second begins in the early 19th century with modern steel production, fossil fuels and electrification. And the third, often known as the digital revolution, begins in the late 20th century with the internet and modern computing. Xi is apparently hoping that the fourth industrial revolution happens in China. However, if this doesn't happen, the CCP risks going the same way as the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, which invested massively in science and technology while suppressing domestic demand in the mid-20th century, in the hope of out-innovating the West. These investments didn't pay off, accelerating many communist regimes' descent into austerity and then outright collapse. Now, what's something that the TLDR audience have in common? They're willing to learn something new every day. And while our videos are a pretty good start, a lot of stuff we talk about can seem pretty complicated, especially when we dive into analytics and detailed data. Luckily, there's a fun and easy way to learn more, which also doesn't cost thousands of dollars or take years of schooling. That's because Brilliant is the best way to learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in maths, data analysis, programming, and AI. Each lesson is filled with hands-on problem solving, broken into tiny accessible chunks, designed around your busy schedule. This means that by spending just a few minutes a day, you can accumulate new knowledge over time in an actually fun way, and you'll also feel the satisfaction that comes with bettering yourself and staying ahead. For instance, perhaps you promised yourself that this year you'll learn some programming skills, but there just hasn't been enough time, and the year is now coming to an end. Brilliant's growing number of programming courses are a great way to build foundations and learn real-world applications with courses on Python, essential coding elements like loops and variables, and even developing your mind to think like a programmer. To try everything Brilliant has to offer free for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/TLDR or scan the QR code on screen, or you can click the link in the description. That way you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thanks for your support.